Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Joshua Gleich. I'm the Associate Director of Administration for Columbia's ERM program, and I'd like to welcome you to today's first event of the spring 26 semester, the board's role in risk strategy. Before we start, I'd just like to point out some of our upcoming events for the semester. Our ERM weekend seminars run through the entirety of the spring semester, Friday and Saturday mornings. We have a Land Your First Job workshop coming up for students at the end of this month. We also have three events for the remainder of the semester: Quantifying Cyber Risk, our featured alumni series, and AI risk governance and impactful use cases. And now I'd like to hand it over to today's moderator, Melody Feinberg. Melody.
Hello, how's everyone? Thank you for coming. I'll do a quick intro of myself. Is that everyone will hear that? So Melody Feinberg, and just to give a real quick condensed version of who I am, I'd say that I literally have probably four quarters in my career. The first quarter was I was CPA in town firm, and the second quarter was I was in finance roles at investment banks, primarily JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. My third quarter was I was Chief Risk Officer of the Federal Home Loan Bank in New York, which is a $150 billion wholesale bank. All right. I've never been accused of being quiet. So amazed. Is this better? Okay. And then the fourth quarter is the one that I'm in. Hopefully it's not in these, because then there'll be a lot more in. This is the fourth quarter. And I serve on two corporate boards, one a bank and one insurance company. I'm the chair of the Community Bank. And I also am a Part-Time Lecturer at the school. And that is me. And we also have Ron. And this is Ron's background. I'm going to just do a little bio. I know there's a lot there.
Sure. Well, you can see the bio, as you probably can see, that I've been through quite a few iterations over my career, with risk management being kind of a unifying drive across them all. I started with banking. I was a banker for 25 years with a number of organizations, including working for Bank One for Jamie Dimon as his chief risk officer, retail, and also as the chief risk officer of Washington Mutual. After Washington Mutual, I went into private equity for a couple of years and then joined the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, where I was a regulator and a supervisor and represented the Federal Reserve system in Basel at the Policy Development Group of the Basel Committee. After that, I became a consultant working for Jean Ludwig and Promontory Financial, so I had a chance to sort of pass on a lot of what I'd learned over that period of time. And now I am on the board of a French asset manager and investment bank here in the US, Natixis. So as you can see, my career was certainly not a straight line. And I will tell all of you that are starting out in your careers that you could never really plan for where you're going to end up when you're my age. So what is it that drove the entire arc of all of the things that I did? And I came up with two things. One of them is the importance of keeping your intellectual curiosity alive and well throughout your whole career. I learned more on each job than I had ever learned at the job before. And my whole career was all about learning how to cope, how new skills, new technologies. As you can imagine, the financial services sector has transformed multiple times since 1982 when I began, and it continues to evolve at a rapid pace that never changes. The change never changes. The second thing is that I took every opportunity that came along and I created some myself. So I was always very quick to pick up on things that came my way. I ended up, for example, moving my entire family from Canada 25 years ago to join Jamie Dimon at Bank One. He was there. Turns out to have been a great choice, but obviously required a certain amount of risk taking, which is maybe not characteristic for a risk officer. So what did I learn over that period of time? Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I pretty much lived through every single crisis that has emerged since 1982. For the historians in the group, and I have to start talking now as if my background's in history rather than my own self. I started just out of business school with the LDC debt crisis, and it was the near default of Mexico in 1982. Then there was the savings and loan crisis, which you may have studied about, which was a mismatch of interest rate management for the savings and loan. Hundreds of them went down that year in 86. The Asian debt crisis in 98, long-term capital and the need for the 5 banks to come in and rescue it. The dot-com bubble in I guess it was 2000, 2001. And then obviously the mega crisis of the financial crisis of 2008. And for that, I was actually the chief risk officer of Washington Mutual. So I had a front row seat to how that actually panned out in the boardroom. And then probably,
I'm not sure. So is everybody getting a history lesson? So there's a lot of history. This is walking history. So we are the 2 people that is talking today, and I will literally be asking about 10 questions. But before we get into the guts of the discussion, I wanted to get some vibes from the room. I want to ask a few questions of you guys. And the first question I have, because today we're talking about risk and strategy and boards. And you guys are probably thinking, wait a minute, I might be close to being board member. Why do I care about it? You care about it because strategy should be an integral part of how you think, starting out when you're young and then continuing through. So the first question I have, because this is about boards and strategy, is in regard to risk management, do you think that the board's role is 2 options? Is it oversight or is it execution? I want to make sure that we level set as we think about what is the board's role. So if you think that it is execution, that a board of directors is responsible for executing strategy, raise your hand. I'm thinking that no one's so one person. I'm assuming that no one's shy, because if I say, what about oversight? How many people raise their hand? So oversight, for those that weren't sure, absolutely oversight. A board's responsibility, they're really the highest governing body. So kind of like a navigator on a ship. They don't drive the boat, but they decide the destination, they ensure the ship is sound. That is really our responsibility as board members. So that's one question. So the next question, let's see how we think about this one. In development of a project plan or maybe a decision to acquire another company, who do you think is responsible for those decisions? These are big decisions that companies are going to undertake. And I hadn't asked Ron the answer to this, what he thinks, but I have a thought. And I'm first going to ask you guys, and actually, Ron, why don't you participate? Actually don't, because then everybody's going to be led by the historian. So the question is, do you think if you are going to acquire a company or deciding on a project plan, do you think that it is the board or management or both that's responsible? So who thinks board? Who thinks management? Who thinks both? Wow, guys are quick learners. Excellent. Okay, and I have one last question. And this is really to get a sense of the risk appetite in the room. So let's imagine that you guys are board members and you are a board member of the Alex Honnold Company. Anybody know who that is? I think I'm saying his name right. Alex Honnold. So Alex Honnold was the guy who last week scaled the 100-story building in Taiwan. Did anybody see that? So what was crazy about it is that he had no equipment to protect him. Like if he was going to fall, he was falling. So all right, so here's Alex Honnold. He's the CEO of the company, and you are the board. So my question is, Alex Honnold comes to the board and says, board, I want to make my next venture. And my next adventure is I would like to scale the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center is bigger than Taiwan. I nailed that. I'm ready for the next adventure. I'm now asking you guys as board members, would you say yes or no? So who would say yes, Alex? continue, make this next step, scale the bill. All right, so we've got some risk takers. Before there's 2 bonds, you must see or something. And then how many would say, no, Alex Hamill, we are the board, we're going to stop you. So we've got, I don't know if everybody voted, but it looks like more people said stop. So the strategy there is, if Alex Hano prevails, the corporation is great, it's amazing. But what happens if he does not? Then you have no longer have corporation. So I think I think we're teaching the group of individuals very well about how to be oversnapped, because it sounds like you would be a good board. So with that, I think we've got a sense of the risk aversion or comfort in the room. And I'm going to continue on with Ron, that focuses on the board's role in risk strategy. And we started hearing about how Ron kind of came about where it is. And I think that's an amazing adventure. I'm actually going to take it to the next question, the first question. And what we're going to do is we're going to probably have about 10 questions. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So, and this is meant to be interactive. So it's just like me and Ron hanging out and having a drink and kind of talking about risk and for world work. So my question for Ron. So boards must be knowledgeable and current on the organization's other competition, among many other factors. So how does a board get up to speed and remain well informed so they can deliver the best service? And just so you guys understand, board work, guess what? I just asked Ron how many times a year he goes to his board, is in the Natixis board, 6 times a year. So you're not there every day. You are coming in, some public boards are only 4 times a year. So it really depends on the cadence of the board and what's going on. But how do you stay tuned and drive that or understand that, the strategy of that organization to move there so infrequently? What do you do?
Well, I think to be effective as a board member, you need to stay very current and informed about what's happening basically in your sector. So I would say that I talked about being a lifelong learner. I would say that discipline continues between board meetings. I'm a voracious consumer of information. So I look at every morning, I listen to my podcasts and my Substacks, read Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, other publications. I also read a lot of periodicals like risk.net, RMA Journal, and things like that, just to find out what's happening in the minds of risk officers and of banking generally. Well, American Banker, that would be another one that's sort of a go-to almost every day. In addition to that, I go to conferences, which are usually very helpful for giving me as insight into what the latest thoughts are in the boardroom. There's some conferences that are given by a group of directors called the National Association of Corporate Directors. I attend those. They have a major one annually. I think that's where we actually met.
Yeah.
And then there are smaller groups of people that get together. Those are also great networking events. Networking on its own, keeping in touch with the people that you've worked with over your career and finding out what they've done as they've moved off into other areas. It's always very informative to compare notes on an ongoing basis. And then probably more important than any of those things is meeting personally with management between the meetings. And I don't mean that breathing down their necks or meeting with them every week, but just staying in touch with the key people that are going to be bringing issues to the board. So you know what's going on in their minds and you understand what they're thinking 101. I mean, one-on-one, and that you are developing a rapport with them outside the boardroom. Boards themselves, if you're thinking more broadly, how do they stay up to date and effective? One way they do that is through board composition, making sure the right members are on the board. And through self-evaluation processes. I think there was someone I was meeting earlier here that does that sort of work. Through questionnaires, through external consultants, helping them understand how well and effectively they're doing. And then through offsites, which are what can happen between board meetings in a less formal environment. So it is heavy lifting with a big responsibility and not something where you just show up, 6 times a year for 3 or 4 hours or for a day.
I feel the same way. It's like I read an article and I think, how is this relevant to my home, my back? How is this relevant to my insurance? And it's always like a constant churning. How could this have implications? I actually it was last week. I actually went to a conference. So we've heard that there's lots of conferences out there to get the network. I went to a conference last week. Blind spots in the boardroom from a risk perspective. Not a great conference, right? And guess what you have to do? You no longer are with your colleagues every day. So you have to stay current by exchanging ideas. And what's really cool is that you can actually exchange ideas across disciplines. So I grew up in finance. I find everything was all about the financial world. But there's people out there in all different industries. And you go to these conferences, you get different perspectives, and then you connect the dots and you think about the implications of tariffs to a bank. Or there's just it really just opens your mind. So I absolutely agree with you. Never stop learning. I'll say a quick shout out to about a month ago, I went to a 2.5-day conference. Another school in New York, not this one. Sorry. If they offered it, I would have went. And it was all about AI. And that was so eye-opening. It wasn't just about the governance of AI, which is what risk people care about, but it was really AI from the perspectives of people in the entertainment industry, in the healthcare industry. And just when you put that all together, it's just another semblance of information that makes you more powerful in boardroom. So I'm going to jump to make a sponge dance. So there are so many distractions for a risk manager and a board member. There's so much noise. That maybe everything, everywhere, all at once. Light kind of fills in and thoughts. So how do you determine what is pertinent and how do you ensure you're not overdosing on information? You just said you read like 10 publications a day. So how do you get through those?
Well, I think it starts with understanding what the board's role is, and I think your introductory questions were absolutely right on. The board is there to oversee, to create strategic direction, to coach management, but the execution of the strategy is entirely with management. The board doesn't execute on an ongoing basis anything. One of the terms that you'll often hear is noses in, fingers out from the board's perspective, which of course means that you should understand what's going on with management, but keep your hands out of it. It's not your job to solve the problems on a day-to-day basis. It's interesting. The Federal Reserve and all the regulators put out all of these notices as to what they consider to be best practices. And in the Federal Reserve case, which is where I work, they have called SR letters, supervisory and regulatory letters. And these are letters that they put out periodically saying, this is the way we think the world should be. And if you're not like this, then you get a MRA, which means kind of a matter requiring attention, words brought into it. And they did a survey of their internal documents, and they discovered that whenever they referred to the board, they always referred to the board as board and management. So they would say, board and management needs to oversee this, or this needs to go to the board and management. And they didn't separate the two words. And they started to realize that, in fact, they weren't understanding themselves the difference between management and the board. So they actually issued a new SR letter in 2001, which articulated, some of you have probably seen it, it's called SR 21.3. And SR 21.3 actually articulates this is what the board should do. And it's very clear reading that it is not management. So you ask about trying to stay out of the weeds. That's sort of the guiding principle. Now, in practice, that's not so easy because you've got a bunch of board members, many of whom have had very successful careers actually executing. And they really want to get in there and get their hands on it because I know how to do that. I've done it before, but the reality is that's not the role. So how do boards make sure they stay strategic, and how do the boards make sure management understands their role as strategic, not a management role? And I came up with 3 things the boards can control. The first is that the boards can control the agenda. It can make sure that they're not looking at agenda items that are simply reporting out every month about how things changed or some kind of a vague economic reading about what interest rates will do, that they actually have on the agenda things that are relevant and things that need strategic input, things that need to be drilled down on from a strategic perspective. Competitive environment, things like that. The other thing is that the board can control the materials it receives. And one of the biggest bugaboos that I personally have is what I would call elevator analysis. So elevator analysis is actually an oxymoron because it's elevator narration. This delinquency rate went up, this VAR went down, this market share went up, down, month to month, just describing movements in past history, historical trends. The board needs to see an analysis of those things and it needs to insist on it. So if VAR, you are in the quantitative side, if value at risk goes up in the marketing book, was that because the models were changed? Was that because there was more volatility in the market, but the bank didn't change its position? Is it because it stopped hedging? All of those things can cause a big fluctuation in VAR. But if all you're doing is saying VAR went up, that is of no use to the board. So the board needs to take some control of the actual material it receives and what is presented. And the third thing is the control of the meetings, which means that as management will veer off and get more into the weeds, it needs to be brought back to, yeah, but what's the core here? What's the root cause? Don't describe the breakdown, describe what caused it, describe how you can put controls in to fix it. So a lot of it really is, I think, rests with the board itself to actually monitor and control its impulse to go in and start managing.
No, I absolutely agree. I actually am thinking from the other side because as the chief risk officer of the Commonwealth Bank, I had a responsibility during COVID to report to the board. And if you think about everything all at once, I remember that week of March 2021.
Yep.
That we had an emergency board meeting, remote course. And I had a dashboard and everything was turning risk on. And it could have been some messaging that would have completely alienated people if they thought everything was out of control. So while things were trending high, we had to get that on the table, but we also had to kind of pull back and say that these are the things we're most concerned about. And talking about noise, sometimes I hear a lot of noise, and sometimes I even want to accelerate that noise even more and make something even more impactful. I'm treating you this example. During COVID, every week I would have a meeting with my staff. So this is my risk staff. There's about 60 people. And if you remember the early days of COVID, everybody was kind of a little bit forlorn. So it was kind of half the pep rally. But I always thought of questions that would get them excited about the next week's events. And I said to them one week, what will happen if commercial real estate goes in the same trajectory the taxi cab and the downs went through? You guys probably don't even know what I'm talking about when you're talking about taxi cab downs. So probably 2015 or so, Uber came along. And New York City, prior to Uber, was a sea of yellow. Uber came along and the taxi them. So in order to operate a taxi in New York City, you had to have them down. Guess how much they cost in 2014? Anybody have any idea? A medallion was $1 million to get a taxi cab license for one taxi cab. And actually banks would actually lend, and the collateral was those medallions. Uber comes along, the sea of yellow goes away. Guess the lowest price of a medallion. It's kind of where it is right now. What do you think it is right now? Today, it's $75,000. So maybe it's $100,000. So I think they popped it up a little bit, but it's $700,000. I know the banks went out of business. Melrose, if you look at Melrose Freight Union, you'll have business. So I'm talking about all. So pull back. I said to my staff, what happens if commercial real estate, because the Home Loan Bank had probably $300 billion of commercial real estate that's their collateral. What if it goes by the wayside, like taxi downs? We're going to be screwed. We're going to have a problem. So did I really think that? No. But what I wanted was to charge up the staff to think about it in worst case, and then you get pullback. And guess what? Do you guys think that New York City is going to go by the way of taxi medallions? I don't think so. You're all here. Guess what? People love to be in New York. Anybody that's coming out of college, this is where they want to be. This is still the financial capital. The point was, I wanted to get people thinking about the worst case, and then you fall back and you realize it's not going to be so bad. So do you remember Taxi Medallion?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Crazy world. So with that, I think, the main point here is make sure that you understand all the information, but then kind of prioritize what you think is most critical. But I'm going to move to the next question, and then we might have touched upon this a little bit already. Like, how would you develop this square member perspective? And I think you've kind of touched on some of that already. But how do you encourage a more integrated risk mindset for the board members? Is there anything that you would do?
Yeah. So everybody understands the board's set strategy. So you're going to make an acquisition, you're going to enter a new market, you have a new product line. The board isn't going to weigh in on that. It's going to look at the P&L and look at the implications of that and the opportunities, and they're just going to finance. They'll do the high, medium, low case, and a decision is made to invest, not invest. Everyone understands that that's what a board does. But what boards don't always do effectively is look at what are the implications of that from a risk perspective. So when you talk about developing an integrated view of risk, that needs to be very much incorporated into the board's oversight. And in 1994, the Institute of Internal Auditors came out with the model of the 3 lines of defense. And I suspect, how many of you here have heard about the 3 lines of defense? 100%. That better be a few, because a number of them are in her class, and I know she's taught it. So the 3 lines of defense, as you know, the first line is management, and they run the operation. The second is the control functions, risk management, compliance, and the third line is internal audit. Boards need to embrace that model, and that every conversation that takes place needs to indicate a strong support of risk management, and internal audit needs to be a key avenue for the board to understand whether the policies and procedures are being followed as they've been approved. Internal audit has a special relationship, as you probably know. Internal audit in many institutions reports directly to the board, not to management, just so that it can gain its independence to observe how the whole system is working. And risk management, in essence, is responsible for monitoring and identifying controls, defining controls. Risks, I meant to say, not controls. And then monitoring how those controls are manifest, setting up limits, putting in place rules, policies, and procedures. So fundamentally, every organization is going to take risks, and it's the board's role to make sure that the risk can be priced, and that if things don't turn out the way they're intended to, and the pricing model doesn't cover it. Think about credit cards, for example. You can tolerate loss rates of 5%, but that gets priced for because of late fees and because of high interest margins and so on. It's a very profitable business at 5%, but you need to understand how bad could it be before we'd actually lose money that is beyond our tolerance. So the board needs to show a real support for these control functions and for the risk function.
I think you covered. I'm going to move on to the next question. So I think this is a great question, because we probably have very similar views on this. But how does a high functioning board anticipate and prepare for future uncertainties, such as geopolitical risks, AI-driven changes in banking? There's everything everywhere all at once. How do you know what to focus on? And then how do you know what you might not see today, but it's coming down the pipeline? What do you do?
Well, that's where, people think risk officers are unimaginative. We're boring, we just crunch numbers, we just create models. Actually, no, a great deal of what the risk officer does is to have some imagination about the things that could go wrong. And if you're at the board,
Still my thunder.
oh, didn't we have now? I really?
Is that amazing? I don't think any 2 chief risk officers would ever say imagination.
Oh,
Is that
okay.
amazing?
Oh, yeah. Well,
Anybody?
don't say him.
Imagination? Yeah. Are you too? Okay. We don't admit it. So go for it.
Well, I do think that is a big feature, because the reality is most of the risks that will really injure an organization haven't materialized in history. And we'll talk a little about that when we talk about stress testing and scenarios. But a lot of it has to do with looking at the environment and anticipating, well, what could go wrong and how are you going to mitigate your response, or you mitigate the risk with your response. When tariffs, there's huge operational issues for a lot of these companies, like the car companies. They can't get their parts where they used to. They have to change their supply chains. Have they thought about that? Have they thought about how to change the supply chains? What does that mean for the contracts that they have? How locked in are they? What about the transportation issues? Geopolitical risk. Iran price of oil goes up, but the price of oil is extremely low now. So it's unpredictable. What would you do as an organization if you're an airline, if the price of oil goes up, or if you're a utility and you produce your energy through gas versus coal, and the huge differentiation of prices? All of these things, AI, I don't want to go down that route right now in answering this question, because that would be the rest of the hour. But all of these things require you for an organization to think ahead and think how it's going to mitigate, how it's going to survive, what the impacts are going to be. And I think that's probably the key issue, using experience to try and come up with scenarios that will help in the future when these things become volatile.
I'm thinking, now that I have imagination in my head, Willy Wonka, is there a song, Perfect Imagination, or something that I will not say, even though that is my name, but I love the imagination piece. But to augment that, I would say that as actually get it done, like there's post-mortems, where you look at something after the fact and it's like, what did we do wrong? But organizations are doing these pre-mortems. So we're going to do this new strategy. Let's think about what could go wrong, and let's be 6 steps ahead. And pre-mortems are a better way to do things than just doing a SWOT analysis, which literally focuses on a specific point in time. So I think pre-mortems are really good. And then I think it's also this concept of continuous learning, like we keep saying. You just have to keep chugging along. What else? Restless mind. I've been accused of having a restless mind by my former CEO. It's a good thing. It's a really good thing. Be restless, be creative, have imagination. And then sometimes, guess what? You might not know the answer. So know when you don't know the answer and engage experts. I worked with somebody actually at PwC at one of my organizations. He was a former CIA, so he understood, defense intelligence, but he had a military background. He had different perspective, and he literally worked at PwC and went out to firms and helped them navigate tariffs, navigate some of the geopolitical issues. So the good thing is that sometimes you have to acknowledge that you don't know it all, and you need to go out and seek advice. So I'll get back to you. So let's kind of keep talking about this concept of what could go wrong, because scenario analysis, and I know that classes have been talking about it, but can you talk about the value of scenario analysis as being a good strategic partner? How does that help see you grow?
Well, that's essential. I mean, scenario analysis is really key right now to managing risk. And just to go back a little bit to be the historian, I'm sure you've all learned about economic capital. Economic capital was the big rave at the beginning of the aughts, late 90s, aughts, and everything was being quantified. And in fact, risk officers tended to believe that you could distill risks being taken, whether it was market risk, credit risk, or operational risk, in the form of the amount of capital that you needed to underpin the risks that you were taking. And the way it did that was it looked at past history, it modeled it, it looked at confidence intervals, 99.5% of the time. In the past history, the number never went worse than this. So you could never, with a very high level of confidence, you'd never lose more than this. Well, the financial crisis came along, and the things that happened had never happened before. The housing prices in the US went down across the board, across the whole country. Never had that happened since the 1930s. So none of the models had that in their history. So it underestimated the impact of that. The other thing is that these models, economic capital, they all use this concept of correlation. And everyone knows that trading risk doesn't correlate with retail risk, doesn't correlate with asset management risk. All of these things are they're not correlated, or weak correlation. And so there was a discount taken. And so we don't need as much capital, because we know that if the investment bank has a really bad year, retail won't have a bad year. So we don't need as much capital to support the business. Guess what? 2008 came, everything was correlated, everything went down. All those models were wrong. And as a result, certain banks had capital, Citibank, some of the European banks, capital of 4%, 3%, and there was a failure of the bank system. Economic capital's largely kind of been marginalized now and replaced with these scenarios. So why are scenarios better? Because scenarios are not based on your history. They're based on plausible scenarios. Things that are plausible. That's a key word. It doesn't mean your crazy idea that the United States is going to be, there'll be a nuclear holocaust. And
Or commercial real estate's going to zero.
yeah, exactly. Commercial real estate. But you might say that commercial real estate could go to 60% in New York, even though it had never done that before under these conditions. And this concept of scenarios was actually hard-coded into the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 after Basel, and it created DFAST, the Dodd-Frank Act stress testing, and it created CCAR, the Consolidated Capital Analysis and Review. So CCAR and Dodd-Fast are right in the legislation, and every bank now is required to come up with scenarios and with stress testing. But you still have this problem of a bad thing happens, unemployment goes to 75%. What does that mean? You have to base your answer on your own statistical analysis. And I'll give you an example of how stress testing is taken to the next level. Certain organizations have high concentrations of exposures to individual counterparties, very lumpy. And those counterparties never have defaulted. And so they have nothing in their history suggesting that they never would default. So you come up with a scenario and you say, stresses, the GDP has gone to -5, the stock market's cratered, blah, blah, blah. And nowhere in the history are you going to see these counterparties failing because they're so creditworthy. But you say, something could happen, and they could. So let's run a scenario where 2 of them actually fail on the same day. It's plausible. It's never happened. And you quantify, what does that mean in terms of loss? So it becomes a much more subjective exercise, and you use imagination,
Absolutely.
but plausibly, not because you want to be hysterical, but because you want to understand it. The other way in which scenarios become really valuable is reverse stress testing. And reverse stress testing, because we're going to talk about maybe risk appetite if we get there, is how bad does the risk have to be before it breaches your appetite and you're therefore just not going to go there at all? And if you think about like commercial real estate, which was your example, vacancy rates nationally right now are about 19%. Well, if the vacancy rates nationally went up to 24%, that might be enough to wipe out certain banks. And good scenarios test results will tell you if you're that bank that's that vulnerable with your net that far out into commercial real estate, certain other banks could look at that and say that's not going to hurt. Well, I'm a bank. I don't know how vulnerable I am. How high would vacancy rates have to go before I actually lost $2 billion, which is the appetite that I have for losing? And the answer might be 75% vacancy rate. And you go, well, I don't have to worry about that happening because it's never possible for vacancy rates to be that high. But if the answer is 25, then I have to worry that I'm overexposed. So this reverse stress testing concept, it's just the reverse of stressing for losses. It's actually starting with the losses and stressing backwards to the scenarios. Very, very effective. And banks, of course, and all organizations are using it to try and map out the amount of risk that they're taking.
So it sounds square-to-leg and systematic, and there's lots of work to be done. I want to transition a little bit. AI. How can boards use AI? How can you use AI to enhance your understanding? And everyone is in this together. Is it a crutch? Is it a tool? How do you think of AI?
It's a broad subject, of course, and there's no day that doesn't go by or no conference that doesn't take place that this isn't a major issue on the agenda. It's all so volatile right now. China comes out with DeepSeek, suddenly, whoop, that horror movie Shudder, that company that does the horror movies called Shudder, the whole market shudders. And then Google Gemini 3 comes out, and the market shudders again because Google's beat everybody else, and so Grok and ChatGPT lose lots of credibility. And then just yesterday, or maybe it was today, Agentic came out with a new model for legal modeling, legal documentation, and all of the documentation publishing companies lost a huge amount of value on the market. We're going to see a lot of that. It's a promise right now. It hasn't actually resulted in anything real, except that it's made our lives a little more easy when it comes to writing documents and doing searches and research. Boards themselves, of course, don't have an ability to actually use AI because they aren't a thing. They're a group of people that get together a few times a year. But I think that because maybe of my risk background, I'm always interested to see where the organization's trying to use it. I'm very concerned about issues of leakage of information outside the company, so that there have to be strong barriers around it. And it's really at the experimental role, but I certainly wouldn't want to take our hands off anything or see management take its hands off anything and run it on autopilot.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Think about culture. I think in boards, you have to look at the corporation's view of AI in the culture, because culture and governance, I think, are very critical. Let's start with governance. So if that board sees a company that's highly governed and doing things without having the right level of controls and direct cleanliness and building bias into their models, then that board should be very suspect. But the culture to me is very important, because I'm actually seeing this 2 boards that I'm on, that is management telling people it's okay to get out there and to play within boundaries, or don't go there, stay back, let's wait for others. If a company's culture is to stay back, wait for others, they might miss an opportunity, which is absolutely a concern. But I think that we also have to think about the culture of people, and people are going to change in organizations. They're no longer going to be required to do something routinely and get paid for that. They're going to get paid for results. They're going to get paid, to me, less for what they know and more for what they can learn. So I think organizations that recognize that in the culture of that organization will thrive, and companies that don't recognize that are going to have problems. And I really think, think about, I am very pro AI as a tool. It's one of many. It's not my last resort. It's one of many. It augments what I already know. And if organizations think that way and they get people the ability to fail. So as somebody said, I'm going to do X, this grandiose thing. Well, maybe you shouldn't start with the grandiose thing. Maybe you should start with small little baby steps. And if you fail, you can get back up. And if organizations build that culture and think that way, I think an organization will get stronger and get through this and get to the other end in a very positive way.
Well, by the way, what you just described in the credit card industry is called champion challenger.
Okay.
Where you take the champion, which is your portfolio, and then you challenge it with a different routine, a different set of credit for maybe 5% of the portfolio. And you run that in parallel for a while. And if the challenger does better than the existing portfolio, then you roll it out. But it's sort of a test and deploy system.
Yeah. I would always say that AI acts as if there are no borders, right? It doesn't think of borders. It's going to do what it potentially can move beyond. But governance behaves as if there are borders. And if you aren't playing by the old governance rules, something is going to fail. You need much more to stay one step ahead. And if organizations are not staying one step ahead and they're using low governance, there's going to be articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times when we wake up in the morning and read our papers, right?
By the way, we didn't talk about quantum or even better, quantum AI.
Or that huge day. What's the quantum day?
Yes. Or how blockchain is going to transform payments.
Yep.
I mean, this is AI is, and besides, we're talking about large language models. We're not talking about a general AI, which will create new proteins and materials and transformed astronomy and the medical vaccines. You guys are all really lucky. You're at the beginning of a huge transformation technologically that is going to drive things that you can't even imagine any more than I could have imagined Uber 15 years ago.
So we're going to bring that for an AI session in another time. We could literally fill that.
We could.
A year from now, we'll be probably speaking very differently about. But we promised you.
And in the IAD, we'll be giving the presentation.
That's true. Yeah. We're sitting on a beach somewhere. So we promised strategy. Let's talk a little bit more about strategy. How do you define strategy, and what's the board's role in strategy?
Well, strategy is a high-level plan which articulates an organization's long-term goals. That's strategy. So I think we talked earlier about integrating the risk concept or risk framework into strategy. So what does that mean? Well, in order to know how much risk you want to take, you have to define it. And as you all know, you define it as risk appetite. And what is risk appetite? Well, risk appetite is the amount and type of risk that you're willing to take in order to achieve your goals. And it can be very subjective, like we want zero sightings for anti-money laundering violations, or it could be very quantitative. We want our value at risk to stay at $85 million for this business, and so on. But the important thing is the plan and the risk appetite and the quantification of the amount of risk that's embedded in the strategic plan need to happen symbiotically together. And when the board reviews the strategy, they should also be determining whether the strategy is within the risk appetite. So I know this is all very conceptual, but it is really important. And it is actually operationalized in many organizations where they sit down and they look at the amount of capital that they have and how they want to use it and how much risk they're prepared to take that they can't price for. And I keep saying can't price for because if you can price for the risk, that doesn't use capital. That's your business. You use capital when you can't price for it or when the costs come over what you expected and it blows through your pricing model and you actually lose money. And it goes, of course, against retained earnings and you lose capital. Understanding what those risks are and quantifying them is an important component of strategy. And that's where, going back to the first and second and third lines of defense, internal audit, the third line does not participate in the development of strategy or in determining risk appetite. But the first and second line are joined at the hip because the first line is going to articulate their strategy. They're going to quantify it. They're going to do the high, medium, and low case. And risk management is going to try and dig into it, peel it back, and understand how low could medallions go before this business that we do in about medallions. It's the only business we have before it gets so bad that we lose our bank. And you have to assume that no one did that calculation in the case of, was it Melrose?
Oh, yeah, no.
Melrose, yeah. That was your example. And you wouldn't have had to go to zero for them to fail because that didn't actually go that far.
Absolutely. When we talk about risk appetite, I assume that you agree with me. It's not a control exercise. It is a strategic choice. It is strategy. And, when the board says, and I think you just started very well. Yes, we want this type of risk. We want you to venture here. We don't want you to venture here. And we want you to control this type of risk. That is all a choice. And that is the board's responsibility ultimately to handle that choice.
I mean, a good example would be a bank has decided to go into reverse mortgages.
Yeah.
And reverse mortgages are a little weird because, you give the money out as mortgage payments over time, and eventually the value of the house is depleted. There are a lot of
little old ladies.
And it's the people who need cash, right, who thinks I got a paycheck, which is my own equity being given to me over time at a charge. There's some real ethical issues associated with it. And in my view, that's a personal view, although there are businesses that survive on it. That's a strategic choice, and that's also a risk choice. There's a reputational risk. There is a consumer compliance risk, a fair housing risk. There are lots of risks associated with that business. It could be very, very profitable. So finance would come in with a business plan that would look return on equity 35% for this business. Requires almost no capital because this thing's completely over-securitized or over-secured. On the other hand, there are all these other risks, the compliance risks, reputational risk, and so on. And being able to understand the full range of risks when it comes to opportunities like that is how an organization succeeds.
Perfect. When you just gave that example, I don't know if anybody remembers this example. CVS, the drugstore, I think about 15 years ago, they no longer had smoke cigarettes in the store. They made a decision that they were going to pull cigarettes out of their store, their health organization. That could have went really, I think about, I don't smoke, but I know, and maybe 15 years ago, where people were smoking, to make that decision that we want to make a positive statement about health, but potentially lose a large piece of our sales. So all strategy, absolutely. So I'm going to move into the next question because we're getting close to time. My view is that it's never too early to be strategic. And we're talking to a lot of people that are students that are just kind of starting out in this journey. What should junior employees do to build that set of work-life skills? They don't need to wait till they're old like us. They can get it. They could start now. What does that actually look like?
Well, for those of you who are starting out, I'm imagining your first job and you're going to be analyzing or coding or researching, or you're going to be doing some high intellectual impact, but not necessarily broad reaching work. It's unlikely that you're going to be asked whether a firm is
Go into cigarettes.
should have cigarettes in the vendor counter. But you are going to be doing some really valuable work in your particular area, and it's going to be challenging, and it's going to be engaging, and very satisfying if you're lucky, if you find the right job. But that won't really be enough to position you strategically for your future. So my encouragement would be to think broadly about the organization beyond your team or even your department, but think about the division that you're in, think about the business that you're part of, the overall enterprise. Understand what the goals of the organization are, what its culture is, how it intends to grow, how it intends to make money. Put yourself in the minds of the senior executives that are actually running it. What's motivating them? Why are they making that decision? It's very unlikely. Someone said this to me early on in my career. People don't behave irrationally. They are responding to irrational stimuli. And because, you put people in the C-suite, they aren't stupid. That's probably not how they got there. They may be just very political, and there are things that are operating on them that you don't see. Trying to see the things that you don't see and understanding what's actually going on in an organization is really key. That's what, getting back to your opening comments about strategy, that is strategy. That's having a strategic perspective outside of your day-to-day. So that all sounds very conceptual and hard to act on. So what can you actually do? Well, and I did think a little bit about this because Melody told me she was going to ask this question. I think one of the things you can do is to seek out senior mentors. So mentorship is a bit of a touchy thing. Some companies try and actually encode it and make it formal. But when I think about my own career, mentorship really was that I felt that I resonated with certain senior people that I really enjoyed, thought they were really smart and that they had a lot to teach me. I would say to them, do you mind if I check in with you every couple of months? Just let you know how I'm going and get your sense of, what you see happening. Senior people respond really well to that because it's a huge compliment that you've sought them out. And they can always say, find room on my calendar. And then next thing you know, the calendar's sort of closed forever. That can happen. You have to have, you have to be tough skinned about that, hard skinned. But that finding a senior mentor is actually really helpful in helping you develop that perspective because you will hear them say things like, well, Bill won't agree with me because he wants to do this thing and I want to do that thing. And they'll open up and you get a real insight into what's actually happening in the organization. Ask for assignments outside your area. A lot of companies do these little projects, little work groups. They take someone from finance, someone from internal audit, someone from business marketing group, and they put them together to solve a problem. We have a problem that no one wants to buy this thing. So we'd like you all to get together as a group, think. And this usually junior people, intern type level people who get involved in these things. And then you have your big moment with the senior people and you present it. And I remember getting involved with one of these things in Bank One when Jamie Dimon was there, and there were 8 of them that were presented. And he said, well, those 7 are crap, but I like this one here. So it isn't always going to be, like booming success, but it will broaden your perspective.
Right?
Well, I wasn't one of us. I was one of the 7. So of course he was wrong.
Yeah. It's,
And never stop learning. I think I said that at the onset, but that's another part about preparing yourself psychologically and knowledge-wise for senior positions in the future.
actually, so you never stop learning. And I would also add to it, it's never too early to start teaching. And that doesn't mean in this type of forum, but learn something and then teach it to somebody else. The best way for you to get embedded in that information is to learn it well enough that you can teach it. Push yourself. So any opportunities you have in your career to teach other people is really just a really, really good discipline to get into.